Good afternoon. This is Hanno Ekdahl with Idenhaus Consulting, and I am excited to welcome you to our webinar on identity and access management, project challenges and recovery. In today's session, we will talk about the key drivers that require identity and access management from a business perspective in order to solve key problems that organizations are facing with scalability, managing users, consistently applying security policies and the like, and common project challenges that we see when companies try to implement identity management for the first time, and they typically uncover problems in a number of areas. So we're going to talk about the most common areas, and we're also going to offer up some opportunities to mitigate those risks and recover from those risks if and when you do encounter problems in your implementation. So this next slide here is our agenda for the day. We're going to start off with some introductions. So I'll tell you a little bit more about myself and then let Jerry do the same. He's our chief architect. He's also on the call. We'll provide an overview of identity management, talk about the business drivers, common challenges, and wrap it all up with some critical success factors at the end. So Jerry, with that, since you're first on the slide here, I'll let you give an introduction of yourself.
Hello, I'm Jerry Combs. I'm the principal architect for Idenhaus Consulting, and our focus is on identity management and security, and we've been doing identity management implementations for major companies around the world for over 20 years now. So we want to take this opportunity to share some of that experience with you.
Thanks, Jerry. And I am Hanno Ekdahl. I'm the founder of Idenhaus, and we provide cybersecurity and identity and access management services, mostly to the Fortune 500, as well as government clients. We also work in the higher education space and have been in the game for a while. The company is in its 5th year, and as Jerry said, we've both been doing identity management work for about 20 years. We have a lot of senior consultants and are really excited about solving the very complex problems that our customers face, integrating policies, processes, and technologies, and making the whole solution come together. We really see ourselves as strategic advisors and look to have a strong linkage between the business value that identity management is trying to drive and the technology and how it's implemented. So let's start with a definition of terms. What is identity and access management? We can really break it into 2 separate definitions, right? Identity management back in the day was really about the systematic collection and distribution of high quality identity data to connected systems in order to support the provisioning of users, the basic provisioning of users, moving that information around to the systems that needed it so that they had the most accurate current information on the user for that access. The second piece is access management, which are the systems and processes that can control who has access to IT resources. You gotta be kidding me. The IT resources and what each person is entitled to do with those resources. Jerry, is there anything you'd like to add?
Just like to make sure that we put a little extra emphasis on the distribution there. So not only do you have to find your sources of information and put in place processes to collect your identity information, you need to have processes to maintain it, to make sure its quality is good, and to make that information usable. But you really can't use it until the distribution is taken care of. You've got to be able to get the information to the systems that need it.
Thank you. So why do organizations implement identity and access management? The reason is that it's not just about authenticating the users. Otherwise, we could just get by with a small set of data. We need to know your username, your password. It's really about having enough information to understand your role, that is the user's role, and their relationship to the organization. And that relationship changes over time. So attributes such as department, job title, cost center, a person's manager, all these things change over time, and they affect things such as the access that you need, who gets to approve requests for additional access or additional resources that are assigned to you. And so that's the second piece of our Venn diagram here, is providing the right resources to our users after they've authenticated, right? And so we're looking really here at things like role-based access control, attribute-based access control. We have rule-based access control. There's all sorts of ways we can provision access to the user once we know not only who they are and they're authenticated, but we also have enough data on that user to provide appropriate access for that user in the context in which they're accessing our systems. And the third leg of the stool here is personalized content. So if you think about it, you can create your own profiles in these applications. Those profiles can be maintained through the identity data that's synchronized around. We can also start delivering content to you based on who you are and what your relationship is to the organization, which includes things such as notifications and other things within the applications. It drives end user experience and productivity. For example, let's say you're a manager in the organization, and there may be a different set of services available to you in our portal because you're a manager. So as a manager, you get to approve timesheets and expense reports, and there are other tasks that you have to do. We can present that personalized content to you in a portal because we know who you are and what your role is in the organization. So external to the organization, we have a very complex business environment, which drives organizations to respond to these pressures in addition to their own desire to get their arms around the house internally and manage their users better. We also have these external drivers that are pushing on the organization at the same time, right? So there's a need for efficiency, improved end user experience. We're also governed by regulatory requirements, whether that's HIPAA or PCI, SARBOX. Sarbanes-Oxley requires that we have the proper controls in place. How do we demonstrate that we have the controls in place? It becomes very difficult if our processes are manual, and especially if we're a very large organization. Well, the nice thing is with identity management, we can connect different systems together. We can synchronize identity information. And as we talked about on the previous slide, we can manage your access based on our understanding of your relationship to the organization. And as that relationship changes, we can add and remove access as appropriate. So if someone gets promoted, we can grant them that next level of access, but they may no longer require access to another system they did in their previous job. So we remove that access. At scale, adding and removing access consistently in a manual way is very difficult. And quite honestly, it's fraught. It's prone to human error, omissions where people don't actually complete the task they're supposed to complete, or they do it in a non-timely way so that they don't meet the regulatory requirements to have the HR system in alignment with the IT system. So if someone is terminated, as an example, they should also be disabled and terminated in the IT systems. Oftentimes, organizations have a significant lag between someone leaves the organization and when they're actually removed from downstream systems. So identity management provides the unifying framework that allows us to organize our processes and procedures and policies around that user identity and then take action on that user as their relationship changes. Jerry, is there something you'd like to add to this slide?
No, I think you've covered it very well. The key point is that there's a lot of complexity and it just keeps growing.
So as we look forward to identity management and think about the complexity of our own organization, systems and processes in the organization tend to be very complex, and they tend to also not be very well joined together. So there's a big disconnect between the business process and the IT systems and how they work together or better yet, how they do not work together. So for example, HR is oftentimes onboarding, offboarding, and moving employees into new positions all the time. And if it's not, that data is not connected to an identity management system, those changes happen independent of changes to the user's access, their profile and downstream systems, and what they can see and do. So how do we manage that complexity to drive the end result that we're hoping for, which is a streamlined, efficient process that's relatively easy to manage and also provides us with the visibility we need to demonstrate compliance with regulations? It's one of my favorite quotes, which is, automation makes a system of many appear fewer. So we can take that complexity of all these different systems and we can make it appear much simpler by connecting HR with an identity store, with downstream systems and directories like Active Directory and other applications, to hide that complexity from the end user, who now has a much more seamless, efficient experience through onboarding as well as offboarding. And it solves the regulatory issues because policies are applied centrally, they're applied consistently, and it also gives us a one-stop shop for audit data, as well as managing workflows, where we can demonstrate that if someone has elevated access, that they requested that access, who approved it, when they approved it, and that's all logged and reportable in the central repository. So let's take a step into identity management and look at how the architecture comes together. So in this high-level 50,000-foot view, we can see the authoritative sources on the left-hand side. So these sources are the high-quality data that we want on our users. So if you think about an employee in the HR system, they have to get paid. There are all sorts of legal and reporting requirements on the organization to make sure that data is correct, it's accurate, and it's maintained. And the key piece here is that that data is maintained. So the latency and the currency of that data is very low. Now, if we connect that HR system to an identity store and synchronize it down, now we don't copy all the attributes. So if you have a social security number, we're not going to synchronize your social security number into the identity store. And quite frankly, we don't need it. So we try and minimize, we try and completely eliminate sensitive data to the extent possible in the identity store, and it's very rarely required. We synchronize that information in the identity store, and then we have now made it available to service directories that are providing authentication services to the ultimate consumers of this user data, right? So we have Active Directory, which might provide our file and print, virtual directory service, which might allow multiple directories to appear as one. So if we're dealing with different partner organizations, or we have a complex directory environment for whatever reason, we can abstract that complexity through a VDS. And then that ultimately drives applications to the cloud, our Office 365, on-premises applications that are authenticating against AD and these other services that we've stood up. And so the whole system comes together end-to-end with authoritative sources feeding data into this identity store and providing it to the downstream systems that require it. Jerry, anything you'd like to add?
Just want to point out there on the left that there are many authoritative sources in most organizations. In some organizations, their directory can be an authoritative source for some information, their email system, possibly their badging system or phone system. So you need a standardized, structured way to bring that data together, maintain it, control which system is authoritative for which piece of data, and then communicate that data throughout your organization.
All right, let's move on to the next slide. So this is an animated slide that demonstrates at a very simple level how identity and access management solutions work. So we start off with HR hiring someone. So in this case, we have an employee. They're assigned a personnel number in the HRIS system, whether it's SAP, PeopleSoft, Workday, We record some demographic information on the user. We get their first name, their last name. And then once that record has been created in the HR system, it pushes the information and publishes it to our identity store. So in our identity store, we have the demographic information we need, first name, last name. We get the personnel number from the HR system, which, by the way, is also a unique identifier. So within the HR system, the personnel number is unique for each and every single user in that database. So it's, in essence, a unique key for that user that ties them back to their personnel record. Now, the identity management system assigns a user ID and an email address to this user. So all employees get a network access, which means they need a user ID, and they also get an email. So they get assigned an email address automatically, as well as a number of other attributes that can be assigned by the identity management system. The IDM system can then synchronize that user ID and email back to the HR system. So we've really exchanged a set of unique keys. The personnel number from the HR system is in the identity store, and the user ID, which has to be unique, and the email address, which also has to be unique, have been stored in the HR system. Now, the nice thing about this is we now have referential integrity between the two records. So if HR makes a mistake, duplicates a record somehow, or makes an update to the email that they shouldn't have made, we will notice those differences and we can check for those in the connectors. So it's a way for us to make sure that we're only updating the correct Bobby Doe in our identity store with the one in the HR system that is actually the same identity. Now, those kinds of things are very important, where you do have a unique identifier that's synchronized around so that we can accurately match up records between systems. In addition, there are consuming systems downstream. So the identity store could synchronize this to an internal white pages application that also allows users to have self-service access to some of their data. So we send down the first name, last name, and email address. It's published in the white pages. And there's an opportunity here for the user to manage their phone number. So Bobby updates his phone number in the white pages or the user profile. And then we can synchronize that data back up to the identity store. And if we wanted to, we could synchronize it all the way back up to the HR system. So in this way, we can provide some self-service tools for the end user to maintain some of their information. We can also allow them to manage their preferred name if we'd like, and have that synchronized around. So there's a number of different ways you can architect this solution to provide self-service tools. And you're also at the same time exchanging unique keys between systems that are uneditable in order to make sure that the data has integrity.
Some of you may be asking, we're mentioning synchronization of data a lot and duplicating data in different systems. And the reality is there have been efforts to build systems where there's a single instance of each piece of data, and you dynamically get that information when you need it. The problem is this doesn't work all that well for the distribution of that data. Applications have their own data stores, they have their own user stores, there's different service level agreements, there's different caching of data and other information. So it is really important that you're able to distribute the information to the native data stores of each of your applications and systems. So there is a role for dynamically pulling data from your identity system, but there's also a role, a very strong role, for synchronizing information to get it where it needs to be. Okay,
Thanks, So I'll move along now to common challenges with implementing identity and access management. So I think we've done a nice job laying out the key drivers, showing how a high-level conceptual architecture comes together, and how identity management works with a simple use case example. And while that seems very straightforward and easy, it's a lot more complex than organizations typically realize until they get into these projects. So 4 common areas where we see problems our data quality, the old garbage in, garbage out. I like to say you get bad results faster if you automate and have bad data quality, because you're just moving bad data around and you're going to get bad results. And another challenge that organizations face is too broad of a scope. So they may start off with a fairly discrete, well-defined scope and find that as momentum builds behind their implementation, they're asked to do more and more and solve more of the business's problems, and have a difficult time holding the line on that original foundational scope, and wind up getting too broad and are unable to deliver all the functionality that the business wants in that first phase of work. And it can create a very bad user experience, bad project experience. The next issue is business process misalignment with identity and access management. So the technology is going to change and the processes around it have to change. We'll talk about some issues with misalignment of SLAs and how incorporating an analysis of business processes up front is a key part of having a successful project down the line. And the last piece that we're talking about is stakeholder pushback. So when we survey customers, we found that actually stakeholder pushback is one of the most common challenges that's faced, where there's someone who feels left out or is not bought in and is pushing back on the project and slow rolling the work. HR is a key stakeholder. If they're not on board, it's going to be very difficult for any organization to be successful with their identity and access management implementation. But that can also include some downstream things such as asset management. So if asset management requires a 10-day lead time to provision a workstation, and they're not willing to change that, and we're automating things, we may wind up in a situation where people are not getting their equipment as timely, and so the end user experience degrades. And we'll talk about things like that too. So let's dive right into identity and access management and accurate user data. It seems to have been a theme in this presentation so far, as Sherry pointed out, and we're going to continue that theme here. Last time we're probably going to talk about data quality, but if I'm trying to establish your identity, your relationship with the organization, are you a manager? Are you an administrator? Are you an executive? It determines what you have access to. It determines your level of privilege. People that you manage, it's also important because you're going to be approving their requests, what assets you're assigned, and it also helps us link your identity across different systems. So the identity islands problem is one that we see a lot, where we have administration of users in individual systems, and each system may have a slightly different flavor for how they create the username or the display name, and it becomes very difficult to link someone up across different systems without some sort of unique identifier to bring them all together. So one of the things we like to recommend is that organizations begin their identity management requirements design with a data map that begins with a system of record in the identity management solution. So that will help you determine the user attributes that you need to synchronize between the systems, where the source attribute is stored, and which destination attribute is receiving that value. So you know, may be location in your HR system, but it may be the letter L in your Active Directory, because Active Directory calls location L. You need to understand what the attribute names are and how the data flows between the different systems. It establishes the basis for integration and also lets you identify things such as, is the data in the proper format? Are you sending a text field to a text field, numeric to a numeric? If you're not, then you're not going to be able to process that data. You also want to look at extracting some of that data from your system of record, your HR system, for example, to see if anything's changing in the current system. So if an Active Directory is our identity store today and preferred name is managed in Active Directory, but the preferred name in our HR system is different, if we connect the two systems together, suddenly we're changing people's names. And if you start changing people's names, it tends to be a very bad user experience. They're not expecting that change, and a lot of people tend to get upset because we've seen this happen before. So you really want to verify up front that the data is accurate to the extent possible and recognize that HR is not going to be authoritative for all user attributes. And the last piece is we also recommend developing a validation plan that allows you to go through, look at each attribute, look for errors in the data, look at logical groupings of users when you're looking at the data, for example, employees, contractors, customers, vendors, and then identify your level of confidence in that data, right? Is it completely validated? So your employee data may be completely validated because you have really good process and controls around that. On the other hand, contractor data may be poorly managed because it's in some database that's updated once in a while by the manager, and they don't, they'll make up data when they enter it in. All those things need to be looked at. So data quality is something that all organizations struggle with because it is a very difficult problem to solve. It requires governance, it requires discipline, it requires housekeeping processes that, quite frankly, many organizations are just not willing to invest their time and energy in. And the end result is that their data quality is not as good as it could be, and as they look to automate, they tend to get poorer results than they had hoped for because the data quality just isn't there. So I'll give you an example or a mini case study here where we have a previous client. It was a mid-sized organization that had been operating with a decentralized model. So each line of business was able to manage their own HR processes and user administration tasks within their BU. Now, this organization had a central HR function and HR system, but the departments really relied on their own manual processes to manage things like promotions, position changes, and maintain user data in their own local systems and spreadsheets. And now occasionally they would synchronize that data or send the data up to central, and then central HR would update their system. These departmental processes were loosely coupled with a central HR function, and the end result was that when changes happened in the department, there was a fairly long latency between when that showed up in the central HR system. And that's actually caused some pain for the employees. So if you were promoted, your title would change, your position would change, and also your paycheck would change. But if that change wasn't synchronized up for 30 days, then your next paycheck was wrong, you were showing up in all the directories incorrectly, and a lot of people got unhappy with the user experience in that model. And so as this organization looked to implement identity management for the first time, they realized that they had a data quality issue, number one. Number two, they didn't have a good solution for collecting that data earlier in the process without totally disrupting their business culture. And so we did an analysis of their HR system, and it turned out they actually had the ability to delegate a subset of functionality to these department heads. And so we rolled out a new solution where there was basically, and the admin in the department became an embedded HR person as well. And some of the basic updating and promotional functions they could actually perform in their department in the central HR system. So those changes now happened real time in essence and synchronized around where they were needed. So this allowed them to centralize. It did establish the HR system now as the authoritative system instead of a combination of the central HR plus local databases and spreadsheets. And it realigned their business processes where now admins were doing their work in the HR tool instead of doing it within their own spreadsheets and local databases. Jerry, do you have any comments either on the case study or on the previous comments I made?
Well, I just want to mention that when you're putting together your project plans or your programs, you need to make sure you allocate sufficient time early on to validate your data and look for data quality issues. And then you should also be prepared for the ones you miss, because virtually everyone misses some data quality issue. And they often aren't found until things roll into production where you're dealing with real data. So you just need to make sure that you do all you can to clean things up ahead of time, but be prepared for those data issues even after go live. It is the cause of many delays and many rollout problems.
All right, let's move on now to the next slide, which is tackling too much at once. So scope creep, scope challenges. How big is too big for a project? Usually we see successful projects beginning with a core foundation focused on the HR connector to the identity store, a connector to the service directory such as Active Directory, and perhaps one other system. The reason for that is the HR connector is the most complex connector that you're going to build. It's required for the vast majority of the user data, and there are the most policies, rules, filters, and configurations in that connector. And it's a bit fraught to get it correct the first time. It takes a good bit of effort. But what we've seen is that organizations that start to implement identity management may have the best of intentions and have a well-defined scope, and they find that the organization suddenly sees that there are benefits that help them solve other problems they're having if they could just connect to their system or just support an additional user type that they're not supporting today. So you may start off scoped with employees only and then be asked to manage contractors and partners in addition, which adds additional authoritative sources, additional rule sets, additional data quality problems, and the like. So I'll give you an example where we had one client where the CTO was briefed on the identity management project and had some conversations with some partner organizations that were really struggling to get their users onboarded quickly and correctly. And they immediately saw the benefit of piggybacking on this identity management project. And they said to the CTO, hey, we really want to be included in this first phase. It's going to solve a lot of our problems. I think it's going to make everyone's life easier. And the CTO really pushed hard for that and said, hey, this is going to be great. I can see how it's going to solve these problems. The problem is that it tripled the scope of the project because now you're managing some very large partner organizations in addition to trying to manage the employee population. And it ultimately caused the organization to have to drop the integration to these partners and focus on building their identity management foundation. But the end result was they burned through a lot of their budget. They wound up over-promising and under-delivering, which left a bad taste in the executive's mouth. And basically, they were the victim of their own marketing, right? So they did a great job socializing what they were doing, but they didn't do a great job maintaining boundaries and pushing back and saying, look, we can't do that in the same budget, in the same time frame with the work that we're doing. Why don't we do it as the next phase, and we'll prioritize it first for the next piece of work downstream. Now, those conversations are very hard to have. We understand that, but scope management is critical to being successful. It's very easy to increase the scope dramatically by just agreeing to managing a couple different extra user types, which doesn't seem like a big deal, but it really is.
Yeah, one of the areas where we see scope creep is that a lot of organizations will decide on their initial foundation, what in the scope for their initial project, and then someone will come along and say, but we need to get some low-hanging fruit. We need to show a rapid return on our investment. And so they'll add something that keep adding to the project in order to make sure they get enough of whatever that low-hanging fruit is for enough people to make them happy. You really have to be careful about that. So it's part of putting together a roadmap and sticking to it and not getting ahead of yourself.
All right, so let's move on to the next challenge that we frequently see, which is a process misalignment. So we talked a bit earlier about how the technology changes the way the systems are integrated with each other, and it also requires a tighter alignment between SLAs in the HR department and your asset management department or those functions so that the process works seamlessly from end to end. I'll give you an example. So if we hire someone in HR and we may create just a very basic stub record and don't actually completely hire them, if our integration is triggered off of that completion of the hire record, the integration doesn't fire. So they may have created some stub recruiting level data for that employee, and their SLA may be, and oftentimes is, this person has to be created and completed in the HR system 2 days before their first payroll run. So if they're hired on the 1st of the month and they're paid on the 15th, that gives HR 13 days to complete that record and send it through. Now, in the olden days when things were manual and you had workarounds, they might have sent off an email and said, hey, Bob is starting on Monday. Make sure he has a computer and network access and his cell phone and desk space. In this future state where we've automated, the record has not been completed yet because the person is a recruit. They haven't actually been hired into HR, so there's no data in the identity management system, which means none of the provisioning steps have happened. There is no user account. The workstation provisioning hasn't been kicked off. All those systems are integrated, but they're all waiting on HR to actually hire that worker into the system. So the HR process for onboarding a user has to change, and they have to get the data into the system more quickly than they have in the past in order for identity management to deliver on the benefits for the end user. So ironically, we can actually wind up degrading service levels, degrading them by integrating and automating. And it doesn't have to be that way, but you have to be aware that there are risks like this up front where SLAs are misaligned that drive a bad result in your implementation if you're not careful and you don't look at your processes and do that process analysis up front. So we recommend mitigating this by including process mapping in your identity management assessment or requirements assessment up front, that you look at the integration points around the user lifecycle, what happens on a create, what happens on a modify, what happens on a terminate. You look for bottlenecks in the process. When is the data collected? Is it collected at the right time so it's available when we need it? What are the SLAs? What's the HR SLA for getting someone into the HR system? What are the asset provisioning SLAs for giving the person a workstation? Are they in alignment with what the technology is doing? If not, how do we get them into alignment? Are there other provisioning processes that depend on these integrations, whether it's office space, a phone, could be credit card, could be getting someone set up in a key system they need to do their job, time and expense reporting, whatever that is. So understanding that there's going to be a realignment of processes is key to being successful in implementing your identity management solution. Jerry, any thoughts?
I think you covered it well, honey.
All right. Well, I try. So this is the fourth and final challenge that we're going to talk about today. Now, there are other challenges. These are the four that we see most frequently. So there's a broad range of identity management stakeholders that are impacted and touched by the implementation of an identity management solution in any organization, including the help desk, which now may have new tools to reset passwords, to unlock user accounts. They're going to have to learn the system. They're going to have to understand how to work with the new tool. There are self-service tools within identity management for, say, password resets. How does that work? How do they guide users to do the right thing so that we reduce the number of help desk calls? And HR, of course, is one of the key stakeholders because they own most of our user data for employees and possibly contractors. Some organizations do manage contractors in their HR system. Other contractors may be in a vendor management system, such as a Fieldglass, which, by the way, we don't recommend integrating with because it does a very good job of managing vendors, but a not very good job of creating unique worker identities for you to manage in your IT systems. So we've done our own blog, actually, an article on different types of stakeholders and how we would categorize those stakeholders in an identity management engagement. And any organization that's implementing identity management, it's a complex implementation, And we're really talking about an end goal where we're delivering more effective service delivery, where we are trying to efficiently meet the growing demand for services and also reduce unnecessary cost and risk to the organization, which sounds like motherhood and apple pie, but that doesn't mean that we're not going to receive some resistance. So while we have our champions, the people out front who are doing the hardcore work to implement the solution, oftentimes we see that come out of the security organization, so under the CISO's office, or there may actually be a director of identity management. And then we have contributors who are aligned with implementing the solution. Spectators are people who aren't really directly involved in the implementation, but they are impacted. So if you have an end user now that's going to have to change the way they log in, or now we have a multi-factor authentication, there's an education change management dimension to this. We need to keep those people informed of the changes we're making, how their lives are going to change, how this is going to impact them, and make it as painless a process as possible. The wild cards are really your potential resistors to change, right? Where they're going to push back. You don't know exactly where they stand. They may have a political axe to grind for some reason. They're resisting being engaged. We've seen organizations where HR and IT don't get along, and those are the most challenging implementations that we get. I had one customer where the IT department so disliked the HR department that they decided to implement identity management on their own and get the data from an HR database that they were aware of that they thought had all the data that they needed. So they got 8 months down the road implementing their identity management solution, building out their functionality, and then suddenly along the way, they realize, oh, oops, we don't have all the data we need in this table. It's only a subset of the data, and we do need HR after all. So they went to HR, and they asked for help and the ability to integrate with the HR system, and HR was outraged that they weren't involved from the beginning and shut down the project for a number of months. And they basically had to restart the project from zero, this time with the HR department engaged. So there was a huge amount of money spent. It only increased the political tension in the organization, and it really limited what the first phase solution could deliver because HR was not willing to help out as much as they could have with that implementation. So IT and business stakeholders can be oil and water, right? Identity and access management is a business strategy that's dependent on technology. And I really like saying that. It's a business strategy that's dependent on technology, which automates routine administrative tasks while enhancing security and end user productivity.
Right. And you may have noticed that we haven't really mentioned any technology or technical challenges. And there are plenty. But frankly, the challenges that we've outlined here are the ones that you really need to take care of. The technology challenges can be addressed, and they're actually a whole lot easier to manage if you get your stakeholders right, your data right, your scope right. Get the basics in place, the technology gets much easier.
So one of the ways we can avoid, the stakeholder setback, or at least mitigate the risk of that happening, is to begin with a stakeholder identification and analysis exercise as part of your strategy road mapping engagement up front at the very beginning of the project. While you're still in the planning phases, you haven't committed to anything, so there's no real hard decisions necessarily that have been made yet. So anything that someone comes back with isn't necessarily that threatening off the bat, right? So if you can categorize your stakeholders in these 4 boxes, you can also figure out how to treat them and what you need to do. So wildcards really demand a decent amount of attention to engage and consult them so they feel included. They may be standoffish, but as long as they don't actively resist our implementation, we should be in pretty good shape. So this is the final slide in our presentation today. Really a summary of critical success factors, things that we've touched on throughout our webinar today. Beginning with data quality, investigate and understand data quality early, invest the time up front to look at it, to compare it across different systems and figure out which systems are truly authoritative for your attributes. A data map is a key tool to understanding not only what is authoritative, but how and where the data should flow across systems and how it's stored in different systems. Part of that data map process is identifying all your sources of authoritative data. So you have your HR system that's authoritative for employee data. You may have a contractor database that you use. You may have an external portal for customers. There are all sorts of different databases, directories, and systems that could potentially be an authoritative source of data. And it may only be for an attribute or two. So your email system is going to be authoritative for email because that's the location where email is created. Next, follow the 80-20 rule, right? The Pareto principle, right? We don't have to boil the ocean to be successful. Everyone wants the project to be a success on the one hand. On the other hand, you can't design everything to the nth degree, right? It's a journey, really, not an end state. So there's no way to manage all the exceptions in the tool. There's no way to code it for every single eventuality. The idea is that we cover the most fundamental use cases. We automate the creation of identities, the basic access, and then we manage the exceptions either through a workflow or some other request process in order to fulfill that additional access. But the net is that the administrative work goes down dramatically, the consistency goes way up, security goes up, auditability goes up. There are some huge wins. But you're not going to get to a point where your entire IT environment is completely 100% automated from end to end. It's just not going to happen. Adjusting the scope. So if you know what your budget is and you have a discrete understanding of what functionality you're able to implement within the time and dollars that you have to build that foundation, that's a great place to start, right? And that foundational idea that we laid out where it's an HR connector to an identity store, to your Active Directory, and potentially one other system as a foundation to keep it fairly tight and discrete. If you can implement just those connectors, you will see a dramatic uplift in the way the process moves. Which leads us into the last bullet, which is building the right foundation to enable future initiatives. So once that core foundation is airtight and working together, then you can add additional connectors much more easily, and they become smaller, more agile projects. So you may use a waterfall methodology to build out the foundation and use an agile process to implement additional connectors to connect to downstream systems that are fairly discrete, smaller projects that can be done in a sprint type methodology. One other thing we'd like to talk about with regards to the stakeholders is that roadmaps are actually a great way to engage your stakeholders. So doing an upfront identity management strategy and roadmap engagement allows people to see their opportunity, their project, and where it falls in the overall plan. So if I'm a partner organization and I want to be integrated with the identity management solution so you can manage the identities from my organization, they can get access to what they need in yours. If I see that, okay, that's 12 months out after we build the foundation, I can see where my project is. I know when I'm getting it. I may not be 100% thrilled that I have to wait a year for it, but I know that it's coming. So it validates that I've been heard. It communicates when I can expect my project to be implemented, and it shows me that I'm going to get what I need in order to be successful in the operations and business endeavors that I'm engaged in. So I think a roadmap and a strategy are actually a great way to capture all the opportunities, lay them out in a way that's easy to understand, and it also allows you to understand trade-offs between what you get with one project versus another, and allows you to move things around and understand what the trade-offs are when you do that. So I'd like to stop here and see if Jerry has anything he'd like to add in summary.
No, I can't stress that road mapping exercise enough. putting together a strategy, an effective roadmap, getting your stakeholders on board with that. That's what's going to allow you to make progress and succeed. Being able to communicate throughout the organization what you're doing, why you're doing it, and when you're going to get to their pet project. Can't be understated how important that is.
And I think another point building off what you just said, Jerry, is that we're really talking about establishing teams that are comprised of both business and IT stakeholders early in the project, right? To ensure that both sides are signing off on the solution requirements and design before any implementation begins, right? That drives alignment between the business and what IT is doing. It allows us to look at process, policy, and technology in a holistic way so that we're actually delivering value to the business and not just implementing a technology that's only loosely coupled to business value. So with that, I'd like to thank you for attending our webinar today. We look forward to chatting with you afterwards and wish you a good afternoon.